Morning, everybody. I think this is the third time that I've spoke, but if you're here to heckle Laura, remember that my co-presenters are very nice people and they don't deserve that. So I'm presenting today with Lindsay Harris from, she's with the University of British Columbia in the Okanagan, as well as the Kamloops Food Policy Council, and with Damon Chouinard from the Central Kootenay Food Policy Council. And we will be discussing our project that's exploring food hubs as a vehicle for building resilient local food systems in British Columbia. And before we kick off, I'll acknowledge that obviously we're coming in today from a range of different different traditional territories, and just to acknowledge the First Nations of the regions that we live and play on. Next slide, Lindsay. Okay, so this is actually part of a very large multinational, I think, project that we don't have time to fully explain, but the national project is explaining how to advance food system resilience through the use of alternative food networks or alternative fishery systems, which are basically different models that link small-scale producers, farmers, and fishers, and other harvesters directly to their communities. So essentially, it's any food system that exists outside of the normal, large, commercial, capitalist food system that we have. And so within that large umbrella project, there's several different small studies, of which we are one. And what we're doing is exploring what role food hubs could play with it as an alternative food network, basically. And so our research questions are: what roles do food hubs play in regional food systems? How do regional conditions impact food hub sustainability? And what is the impact of major disturbances, things like wildfires, floods, COVID, other types of disasters? And so that's basically my, my flow chart. Really not used to speaking with a mic. So you can see the large overarching project. There's the other regional case studies within the BC Food Hub. What we've been looking at is 2 regional case studies, one in Kamloops and one in the Kootenays, as well as looking at an overview of the provincial community of practice for all the different food hubs in BC. And so today we'll be talking about the preliminary findings from the first year of our study. Next slide. So for those asking what a food hub is, what we have up there is the definition that the BC Ministry of Agriculture has created, which interestingly doesn't look a lot like what the definitions we see in the literature from places like the UK or the US. And so from a research perspective, we're basically interested in all types of food hubs, whether that's food processing and innovation hubs, shared commercial kitchens, distribution. Anything goes from a project perspective. Within the province of British Columbia, the province has funded 14 food hubs, of which there are 9 that are operational, 4 in development, one of them is closed. They also have funded 16 different feasibility studies as well. The community of practice launched in February of 2023, and it was intended to support the food hubs to create a network, basically, an opportunity for them to share lessons learned, to do professional development, tackle problems together as a group. And that has been facilitated by the Ministry of Agriculture, as well as the Tapestry Collective Co-op, which is one of Lindsay's other jobs. Next slide. So I will go over the next 2 slides quite quickly if people, because in the interest of time, but if people have questions, just let us know. So the first of our 2 case study sites is in Kamloops, and it is called the STIR, which is run by the Kamloops Food Policy Council, and it's a commercial kitchen. Next slide. And the second one, the Kootenay case study, is in Creston, and it's the Kootenay Farms Innovation Food Hub, and it functions somewhat similar to the one in Kamloops with a commercial kitchen, but also has different types of equipment in it as well. Okay, and I'm going to turn things over to Damon.
Great. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Okay, the COP attendance was analyzed based on the attendees' geography, the attendees' funding, as in whether it was a provincially funded food hub versus unfunded or alternatively funded, and by ratio of participant types. Our first year analysis of attendance by geography demonstrates a contrast between attendance from the south versus the north. As you can see, we've had one funded hub from the central interior and one unfunded in northern BC. And also the contrast between high to low population densities. And also we're seeing the regional agriculture and pre-existing food sector context of an area playing a role. This is more visible in more granular data where we can see a gap in participation from specific regions like the wine and fruit dominated regions of the Okanagan and the fishing and meat sector in general. Next slide. Yeah, when reviewing the influence of funding on attendance, there are two considerations that were examined. Provincial government funded food hubs and non-funded or alternatively funded hubs and organizations. Government funded hubs have a strong attendance in the COP, as delineated by the light blue in the graph, and non-funded hubs identified in the graph represent a cross-section of active hubs with alternative funding means, or those organizations in the planning and interest stage. The dark blue here tracks other participants outside the target audience and consist of government representatives, facilitators, support organizations, and researchers. So these various participants are monitored for ongoing information on participant ratios in order to understand how the conversation or topics are being influenced. When considering participant ratios, we're also asking who is missing within the context within the current representation and for what reasons. Next slide. Yeah, and to further understand the factors influencing attendance, we tracked attendance and engagement over time to assess further patterns. This was done by identifying the initial invitations list with attendance and engagement over a year. From this, we've been able to identify a core, middle, and outer grouping of participants, with each group representing varying levels of engagement and attendance. This further assessment has provided us with an emergent theory that factors of organizational capacity and values are likely influencing attendance and engagement. And specifically, this is seen in the core group where we find certain organizations show a strong base of retiree board members and or specific values that affect their commitment to the COP. I think it goes back to you, Sarah.
Yeah, so as part of this detailed work, we were looking at not just who is showing up to the community of practice and how much were they participating, but what stage were their organizations in. And so this graph, which I love because it's an explosion of color, basically shows, you have the core in the center here, so the folks that are attending constantly actively engaged. The outer ring or the middle ring, they might be showing up to community of practice, but they're, maybe their screens are off, they're intermittent, that type of thing. And then that outer group, and we've split that up by the stage that the food hub is in. And so if you go and look in, you can see right here in the center, you've got a lot of hubs that are in that sustaining or growth, pardon me, basically different compositions of types of groups, as opposed to on the outer ring, you see this large stage unknown, we're unclear. Basically, it's contributing to emerging theories around the influence of the organizational capacity, of what stage of development they're in, and how that plays a role in their ability to participate. Next slide, and over to Lindsay.
Everyone. Asking questions about the relationships between the different members of the COP has been something that's been very interesting for us. And I would characterize our findings here as very preliminary at the 1 year mark of our study. So in year one, we've looked at the types of interactions at the COP meetings, primarily indicating flows of information from presenters to participants, and then between participants in discussion. But we have quite a few research questions that we're hoping to explore more in year two, really trying to dig into, like, are the participants in the COP actually forming a community? So are relationships evolving between food hubs outside of COP meetings? Are food hub operators following up with people that they've met? Are they strengthening previously existing relationships? And how can we better understand the relationships across the whole provincial COP beyond the 2 case studies where we're digging in more deeply. We've also taken a look at the different topics that have been explored at the different meetings. Each monthly meeting had a different topic, and those topics were informed based on the engagement that Tapestry Collective, the COP facilitators, completed with Food Hub operators in February and March of last year, as well as significant input from the BC Ministry of Agriculture about what topics they want to see happening at the meetings. There are some underlying and recurring topics that are emerging, primarily related to financial sustainability and funding. All of the food hubs are continually struggling in this area, and so it keeps emerging as a topic to explore. And we have further questions that we want to explore in the second year of the study, looking in particular if there is a difference in or if there's a lag time in between what the group would like to discuss versus the topics that are actually scheduled, and how much of the selection of topics is determined by the actual COP participants themselves versus influence from outside the group, such as from the Ministry of Agriculture or the other attendees who are attending that are not the target audience. This gives you an indication of following each meeting, there's an evaluation completed, and so we can track which topics are emerging as most useful for the COP members. Working with Indigenous partners was by far the most rated the most useful topic. Diversifying revenue streams and aggregation and distribution, those were also rated very highly. And then at the 1 year mark, there was also an overall member rating of usefulness of the COP. And so this sort of took into account their attendance, their engagement, their relationships, the learnings that they took from the topics. And so a significant percentage of COP members are rating the community of practice as quite useful or very useful to them.
So when it comes to the emerging themes, what are we starting to see coming out of this community of practice, and what does it mean? And so we're starting to see different potential influences on participation, and we're developing, like, how does the organization's values shift how they're participating as part of this? So for example, Lindsay working with the STIR and the Kamloops Food Policy Council, it's a big part of their organization's values to actually want to collaborate and reach out across different organizations. So it's no surprise that the STIR is well represented in all of the community of practice meetings, and that they are one of the most active hubs in terms of cross-regional collaboration, working with other groups. We see tensions, which I'll talk a little bit more on the next slide. There is that geographic inequity piece that Damon mentioned earlier. There are a lot of rural hubs that are participating, which is awesome, but there are not a lot of hubs from the north, or whether that's participating or just in existence. We see the community of practice emerging as a collaborative space, although, as Lindsay alluded to, there's interference in some ways from external parties. So that was something that I had kind of neglected to mention in the one donut diagram of we are starting to see more other people, ourselves included, like researchers, support organizations, government, appearing in the community of practice meetings, which is good in that there's interest, but bad in that they might take away from the dialogue of the hubs themselves and shift the conversation. This conversation around what is a food hub is a big one, because what we're seeing emerge is very different from what the ministry wants to call a food hub, and it's different again from what we see in the literature across the US and the UK. And there's questions being raised about where's the community of practice going to go in the future. Next slide, please. Food hub influences and tensions. And so through our interviews that we've been doing with the 2 case studies, as well as our observations of the community of practice, we're seeing all sorts of interesting tensions. within the hubs themselves, you really see this push and pull of where are our values and what do we want to do and what do we want to contribute to community, and also we have no money, which I'm sure is a reasonably familiar story here. Place and scale come in as huge influencing factors. The ability to scale up, how far out do you have to draw your geography in order to hit an economy of scale? Place-based factors, what are the local specific needs that are driving the equipment, the participants, and so on. We have external influences around regulation, legislation, funding, in terms of what funders are looking for, political pressures and expectations, and then there's that tension between collaboration and competition, just in terms of people wanting to work together, but also acknowledging that there's a certain amount of competition as well. And so this gets us into considerations for remote and northern communities to transfer this model to other places outside of BC, is very clearly needing to understand who the users are. Is it a single or multiple sector? We could talk a lot about, the differences in hubs between whether they're focusing on one particular sector or multiple ones. And what are the requirements for self-sustainability, and the acknowledgement that there might be an argument to be made that this will never be financially self-sufficient, and that's okay. It still makes a huge value for the communities, for incubating businesses, for food security, and so on. So that conversation is coming quickly. Next slide. With my last couple of minutes, just noting from a transferability perspective, we highlighted a couple of our more remote and more northern examples for folks to take a look at. So there's the Sprout Kitchen in Kootenay, there's the Tea Creek Food Hub, Hazelton, and Peace River. You can see from a ministry funding perspective, they were all funded for a feasibility, but for a feasibility study, but only one of them proceeded forward to being funded to actually go forward. However, they're all still moving forward in their own way. So Tea Creek in particular was funded to do a feasibility study, and I believe that they were, Lindsay, correct me if I'm wrong, but they weren't deemed to be feasible, but they've decided that they're going to do it anyway. And so there's a lot of examples of people taking different approaches to this work and coming up with different outcomes. So Lindsay or Damon, anything you'd like to add before we take questions? Shrug, okay. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming out early on a Friday morning to listen to our presentation. And if folks have questions, we're happy to take them.